Good evening, everyone. And welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. We're working our way through the book Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism by Chögyam Trungpa. And we're still at the very beginning of the book, pretty much. But we've come to the chapter on the Guru. The word Guru is Sanskrit. In Tibetan, it's Lama, which you may have heard of. Teachers referred to as a Lama. And by the way, I'd like to let you know that an eminent teacher, I've never heard him teach, but he's well regarded, Chögyam Rinpoche, is coming. He'll be teaching at the Westchester Buddhist Center on August 3rd, and for Tantrikas on August 4th. There are a few people in here who are qualified to call themselves Tantrikas. That means people who are practicing Tantra. On August 3rd, guess what? He's going to be teaching on Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which he regards as a very important book. He's the book for our age, he says. And on August 4th, for those of you who might be interested in that, he's going to be teaching the Sadhana of Mahamudra by Chögyam Trungpa in the morning, I think. And then in the afternoon, he's going to be teaching Khenpo Gangshar. Khenpo Gangshar was one of Trungpa Rinpoche's main teachers in Tibet. I remember someone asking him early on when Trungpa Rinpoche had just arrived in this country if he thought Khenpo Gangshar was alive and giving teachings. And he said that he felt that Khenpo Gangshar was alive in the play of situations that arose, and that he was probably had passed under the communists. This was by around 1970, and Trungpa Rinpoche had left about in 1959. So that'll be very interesting. Khenpo Gangshar was an interesting person, to say the least. Just before the communists invaded, he had a breakthrough in his own practice and understanding and achieved what is called in the tradition crazy wisdom. This is a wisdom that, when it's appropriate, breaks with convention and acts unconventionally for the benefit of sentient beings, breaking the ordinary rules of behavior. That's why it's called crazy. And Khenpo Gangshar, there's some interesting stories about him at that time. So tonight we're talking about the Guru. Guru, Lama, teacher, the person who will give us spiritual understanding. There are many versions of the Guru, depending on the level of training and accomplishment of the individual. And sometimes it's not even a Guru, it's just a sort of a preceptor or a spiritual friend. Actually, there are three levels of teacher. The Hinayana level, the sort of beginning level of teacher, is a preceptor. That means someone who demonstrates a kind of purity of behavior, that they don't act cruelly or meanly or hurt other people, and that they act for the benefit of other people, and they live a rather, if it's a sort of a classic version of the Hinayana preceptor, a person might live a rather austere, monkish, or nunnish life, adhering to the rules of monastic behavior, and being very learned as well, and teaching the Dharma in a more or less learned fashion. And that kind of person is somewhat remote. They are slightly on a podium, as you might put it, above the student. The second level of teacher is the Mahayana teacher. And interestingly, that person sort of comes down off the podium and actually is characterized by the phrase Kalyana Mitra. Kalyana Mitra means spiritual friend. And this person is more on an eye level with the student, but still very much a teacher to the student, more learned, more accomplished, more insightful, to say the least. And this person might actually function as a friend. So I had an example given to me of a really excellent spiritual friend. He's passed now. He was a Zen teacher and a sort of a confrere of Suzuki Roshi in the Soto Zen tradition. His name was Kobun Chino. And at the time that I knew him, he was a sensei. Later he became a Roshi. He was promoted into being a Roshi. And he was a very wonderful friend. And in those days, my wife and I had a home up in the Colorado Rockies, and a ski home. And Kobun loved to ski, so we took Kobun skiing. And I spent a number of days now and then skiing with Kobun. And he was what I call a kamikaze skier. Not a lot of technique, but a lot of courage. He just goes straight down the mountain. And then afterwards we would go back to the house and, prepare food and laugh and have a good time. And one time I got into a conversation with him after skiing, and I said to him, I said, sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough for other people, being a bodhisattva. And, there's so many examples. An extreme example would be Mother Teresa, dedicating her life to the benefit of other sentient beings. And I said, I'm not saying that I have to do that, but, something more than I'm currently doing, which was teaching the Dharma, but also, working in a business and supporting a family and all that. And suddenly everything changed between me and him. And he said to me in a voice that was very powerful, he said, a bodhisattva finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table, which he was doing. And he just looked straight at me. And I felt like a bodhisattva finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table. In other words, you're in response. You don't go off on some idealized notion of being what it means to be a good person, but you respond to what's asked of you in your life, in a very immediate way. And suddenly everything had changed, and he was no longer just a ski buddy, but he was a teacher. And I think it was at that point that I began to realize that, what was meant by the phrase Kalyana Mitra, spiritual friend, with Kobun. And he was certainly much more learned than I. Later, Kobun became a Roshi. We married. Some of my fellow students of Trungpa Rinpoche became his students as well. And he had a child, a little girl. And the story goes that he was in Switzerland with his wife and daughter. And his daughter wandered into a lake and was drowning. And Kobun went in after her and drowned with her. The two of them died together. And one of his students, who is a good friend of mine, I've known him actually, I knew him in college, Marty Moscow, and others actually, are convinced that Kobun died deliberately in order to help his daughter with the transition. He was a wonderful person, Kobun was. You knew him, Sasha? Yeah. He was such a sweet man. Funny man. Yeah. And the third level of teacher is a Vajra master. And a Vajra master is what's described so often in the Tibetan teachings in this chapter. People like Marpa in his relationship with Naropa. Naropa was his Vajra master. Naropa in his relationship with Tilopa. Tilopa was Naropa's Vajra master. Milarepa in his relationship to Marpa. Marpa was his Vajra master. Also, there's the idea of your teacher's relationship to you. And basically, they're what are called, you can have a relationship with a teacher such as the teacher is your root guru. It's called Sawe Lama. Sawe means root, at the root, like the root of a plant or the root of a tree. And Lama, means guru. And then you can have branch teachers, so root and branch. Typically, you might only have 1, 2, or 3 at the most root teachers. But you can have many branch teachers of all different levels. A root teacher is the one who, there are a number of phrases for it, shows you the nature of your mind, or shares their mind with yours, so that there is a meeting of the student's mind with the teacher's mind. They call it the meeting of the two minds. Or points out the nature of reality, pointing out, showing the nature of mind, sharing mind, the meeting of the minds. These are the typical Tibetan phrases. In the Zen tradition, the root teacher is the one who gives the student satori, which is saying the same thing, pretty much, that the Tibetans are saying. And branch teachers are somewhat less. They give you instruction, teach you doctrine and practices, how to do practices. And they're very, very helpful. And they might share the understanding that you've gotten from your root teacher, which buttresses it, and helps you relax into it and have confidence in it if you didn't. So branch teachers are very important as well. Now, one of the important things about a teacher of any kind is your attitude towards them. On the one hand, there's the ability of the teacher to communicate the Dharma, and that will vary with the individual. And it's very hard for a student to gauge a teacher's competence. And generally, students tend to go by reputation, by supposition, by superficial characteristics, unless there is a meeting of the minds, or that kind of a connection where the magic happens between the teacher and the student. The essence of the teacher-student relationship at every level is communication. Open communication. At the lowest level, the level of branch teachers, the communication might simply be information. Information about doctrine, the texts. At the level of a Vajra master, if you have that kind of a relationship with an individual, the meeting of the minds. It's magical. And that kind of it's the most open communication that one could possibly imagine, or couldn't imagine, really. Usually, we can't imagine it. Only the teacher knows it and understands it, and then gives it to the student, and shows it to the student, and then the student experiences it at whatever degree they're capable of. And by capable of, I mean their ability to open. Openness is the key. Openness means being willing to show your mind without shame, without hiding, without artifice, without design, intentionality, but in utter responsiveness, accurate, genuine responsiveness to the communication from this other individual, this teacher, sitting across from you. So you might say that kind of communication is really the deepest form of friendship, of love, and what it takes is, it's a kind of magic. It's like getting married, or falling in love with someone. I'm not saying it is falling in love, that's romantic. Although there could be that to some degree. But it's that kind of defying reason relationship of openness, friendship, love, communication, connection that can happen between two people. The teacher, if they're a real Vajra master, is utterly capable of it. In fact, that's where they live. Lesser teachers don't. And of course the student is being introduced to this kind of openness by the teacher. So it takes the ability on both sides, and there's really no telling. I once heard Khandro Rinpoche give a talk about this. She's a wonderful teacher, by my lights. when a person says that of someone else, she's a wonderful teacher, that's very particular to that person. They've seen something that moves them in that person who calls themselves a teacher. So it's a very personal and peculiar statement. I don't mean odd, peculiar, but it's peculiar to the individual making it. In any event, she said once, someone was asking her, well, how do you meet such a person? And she said, it depends on you, the other person, and circumstance, and it may not happen in this lifetime. She said this to a large group of people. Actually, at the New York Shambhala Center some years ago, she was giving a talk there. And that was pretty tough. Tough love, tough to hear. She just said, maybe not in this lifetime. But of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, we believe in future lifetimes. The one thing that inhibits the relationship with a teacher, and that really needs to be overcome, is the student's preconceptions about who that teacher is and what they're going to or can get from them. That attitude of wanting to get something, get the goods, get the teachings, get the insight, can be a real obstacle. Because, and the teacher can overcome it, can help the student overcome it if the student is ready and willing to overcome it. Because the teacher establishes a very genuine, heartfelt kind of communication with the student and cuts through that kind of bullshit. So just to point out that kind of materialism, wanting to get something, can be a real obstacle in your relationship to the teacher and to the Dharma altogether. This is the notion of spiritual materialism this book is all about, cutting through spiritual materialism, cutting through the desire to get something. Get something. And even if you do get something, and people do, they might get a moment of insight, a satori experience, a pointing out experience, whatever. Then the likelihood is that the student will say, oh, I had a moment of insight. I got something. And they'll cherish it. They'll hold on to it. They'll try to hold on to it. You can't hold on to it because it's alive in the moment and not in memory. And then the student, in trying to recreate what they saw with the teacher or what they experienced with the teacher, can be plunged into a very dark and painful place, a feeling like I had it, but now I've lost it. So in this chapter, Rinpoche goes through a number of classic stories of teacher-student relationship. One is with Marpa. He starts out with Marpa. Marpa was the first Tibetan to go to India and get teachings there and come back and spread them. He decided that this would be a good living, to go and get teachings, and then he'd come back and people pay him money, right? But it turned out to be a little more real than that. And he went to India and he found this great teacher. He'd heard about this terrific teacher, Naropa. Naropa himself, we'll come to him. Maybe we should start with Naropa. What do you think? Naropa, I'll start with Naropa first. Naropa was a great scholar. And in India, in the 11th century, there had developed a number of universities, Buddhist universities. And in fact, Buddhism was a mostly monastic phenomena. It wasn't a lay phenomena in India. And it existed in monasteries and in these universities, the two greatest of which were, one was one called Vikramashila, and the other which was called Nalanda. And there were others too, Odantapuri and some smaller ones. You can visit the site of Nalanda today, and the Indians have resurrected these buildings, some of them. And the way they do it is they find, supposedly, I hope they're real, they find the sun-dried bricks that were used to construct a building, and then they rebuild the walls up about 3 feet. And so you can see the outline of what was once a building. And I went to Nalanda a number of years ago, and I was standing with a guide, and he pointed to the horizon, which must have been at least 10 miles away. And he said, Nalanda went all the way to as far as you can see. It supposedly housed 10,000 individuals, not all Buddhists, of other faiths as well. And they often had debates, and there was a lot of learning going on. The four main people at Nalanda were the keepers of the 4 gates, north, south, east, and west. And Naropa was one of those. He was one of the 4 most prominent people at Nalanda during his time. And the classic story goes that he was sitting, studying his books on epistemology and logic and whatever it might have been. And this ugly hag bearing the 37 ugly marks. The Buddhists love to do that kind of thing. 37 ugly marks. And she appears to him. And what she actually is there is a deity, a tutelary deity. They're not really, deity is a bad word for it, because that implies some kind of godhead. But these are sort of not human symbols of aspects of enlightened mind. And one of the most important ones is a female figure called Vajrayogini. And she takes a number of different forms, both peaceful and wrathful. Mostly, if you're doing Vajrayogini sadhana, you're working with her wrathful form. And but this was another wrathful form of her, this ugly hag bearing the 37 marks. And she says to Naropa, she says, it's very good that you're studying. Do you understand just the words, or do you understand what they mean? And he says, well, I really just understand the words. And she's delighted. And then thinking to please her more, and he says, and I understand what they mean too. And she gets furious with him, scares the bejesus out of him. Well, that's a funny phrase to use, but she scares him. And she says, you don't understand the sense. You have to find my brother, and he'll teach you. Now, who she was referring to, and Naropa realized this, was Tilopa. Tilopa wasn't really her brother. I mean, she didn't have a brother, Vajrayogini. But nonetheless, he knew who she was referring to, and he set out to find Tilopa. And he couldn't find him. He would have one trial after the next. He's walking down a path, and there's this maggoty dog whose flesh is putrid. He's half alive, and it's lying blocking the path. And there are weevils eating the rotting flesh of this half-dead dog. And Naropa holds his nose and leaps over this dog on his way to try and find Tilopa. And the dog rises into the sky, right? And a voice says to him something like, "Oh, Naropa, until you stop blah, blah, blah," whatever it would have been, "you will never find the guru." And he has one thing like this for 12 years. This goes on until finally he finds Tilopa, and then Tilopa puts him through hell. He'll be walking along with Tilopa, and Tilopa will say to him, "I want you to go, there's a wedding party over there. I want you to go get me some of that cake." So Naropa, they're both in rags, these two guys. And Naropa goes over and he begs, and they blow him off. So he steals some cake, and they catch him, and they beat him half to death. And he's lying there on the ground, moaning and groaning. And Tilopa comes up to him and says, "What's the matter with you?" And he says, "Oh, this fool of a ego that believes in I own my body is in pain." And Tilopa snaps his fingers and says, "Get up," and they go off together. This goes on over and over, 12 years. It took him. And then finally, one day, I don't know the full circumstances, but this famous incident, Tilopa takes off his sandal and slaps Naropa in the face, and Naropa has the moment of meeting of the minds, understands enlightenment, whatever it may be. That's the famous story, and it demonstrates a couple of points. That Naropa was completely devoted to the Dharma, convinced of its truth, that he would undergo that kind of a trial, 12 years, at the hands of this individual, this crazy individual, Tilopa. I mean, Tilopa, was no paragon of sainthood. Tilopa, he earned his living sometimes as a pimp, pimping whores. His name meant pounder of sesame seeds, and he would pound sesame seeds and produce sesame oil for a living. And he also collected the rotten fish that fishermen threw away as being no good to sell, and he would eat them, right? And one time there's this story about Tilopa that some monk or somebody is watching him and eat a rotten fish, and he says, "Oh, Tilopa, you're going to have tons of bad karma. That poor fish is a sentient being, and you're eating it, even if it's the corpse of a sentient being." And Tilopa says, "Oh, really?" And he holds up the fish. The fish comes to life, and he throws it into the water. Lots of stories like that. So what it demonstrates, though, is that Naropa was so devoted to the Dharma that the trials were demonstrations of showing him, number one, where his ego lay, and number two, what the possibilities were for overcoming his egotism and gaining insight. He had enough intellectual and perhaps experiential understanding without being enlightened, the way we all do. That's why we're here. We're doing something so crazy as meeting in this little place on a pouring rain Monday night, right? Because we all have that inclination, that intimation. And he had it in spades from all of his years of study and practice. And so the really, perhaps, I think, that probably the trials that he went through, he recognized them as a kind of purification process, a way of showing him that it wasn't in the ego desires. He wants everything. Ego always wants everything to be comfortable and pleasant, and and like you're going to get all kinds of riches and goodies. And then that's not the way Naropa was living as he tried to follow Tilopa. So he became a great pandit, a great enlightened person. Naropa, as Tilopa did that for him, slapped him in the face, and he went on to become a great sage, practitioner. And by the time Marpa decided to go to India to get teaching so that he could come back and make a living, Naropa was famous. He was legend as one of the great siddhas, power holders, teachers. And so Marpa heard this, and can you imagine traveling from Tibet to India in the 11th century? My gosh, must have been amazing. Lucky you could survive. And he went there, and he heard about Naropa, and he sought him out. And Naropa was very kind to Marpa. And Marpa stayed with him for a few years, and Naropa gave him lots of teachings, and Marpa collected texts. And Marpa had traveled with another guy from Tibet. And they met up again, and they decided to go back to Tibet, and Marpa had all these texts, and he felt that he could really make a good living, and he'd go back to Tibet. And the other guy saw all these texts that Marpa had, and he got jealous. And as they were crossing a river, the other guy rocked the boat and managed to dump all of Marpa's texts into the river, and he lost them all. And he was bereft. But he went back, and when he went back, he realized that it didn't matter, because what he had remembered, what he had understood and internalized, he didn't need the text for. But then he decided to make a second journey and find Naropa again. And he went back to India once more. But this time, and each time, he collected a lot of gold, because, you have to have money to buy the teachings, to pay for the teachings. I remember in the early days in Boulder, when Rinpoche was doing seminars, and we would have a price on these seminars, and there were all these hippies who were flocking to Boulder. Boulder was a jumping off point for communes all over the place. There were lots of people coming because they'd heard about Trungpa Rinpoche too, and this Tibetan guru. And and I was helping to run these seminars, and I'd be taking the money at the door. We needed to make money to survive, pay for Rinpoche's house, and he had a wife and a baby on the way. And these people would come and they'd say things like, "Hey man, Christ didn't charge for his teachings," or "Hey man, I got this banana bread. I don't have any money, but I got this banana bread. Can I give you the banana bread for the teachings?" I can't tell you how many times we used to just laugh about this over and over again. So each time Marpa went to India, he took a lot of gold dust. And second time he went, and he finds Naropa again and asks for teachings, and Naropa says, "You got to pay me." And so Marpa takes out a portion of the gold and offers it to Naropa. And Naropa looks at it and he says, "No, not enough. More. And finally, Marpa has to give him all of his gold, which he needed. He needed to survive, and how's he going to get back to Tibet? And there's this famous occurrence where Naropa takes the gold and he flings the gold dust into the air, and he says, "What need have I of gold? The whole world is gold to me." So Naropa gave Marpa teachings. Marpa stayed with him, but it wasn't easy, and it was much more difficult this time. And then Marpa asked for a particular kind of teachings. I forget which they were. Doesn't really matter. And Naropa says, "No, I don't have those." He said, "You need to go see a friend of mine. His name is Kukuripa. Tell him I sent you." And so Marpa goes and finds Kukuripa. And Kukuripa lives on an island in the middle of a poisonous lake. And this island is full of nasty female dogs. And they're all biting Marpa, And he's trying to find Talopa. And finally he finds Talopa, and I forget how he does it, but he convinces Kukuripa. And he convinces Kukuripa that that he's genuine and he should have teachings. And at that moment, the dogs all become friendly, and he stays and he gets the teachings he was seeking. And then he goes back to Tibet. And Marpa is an interesting example of a teacher, because he was a householder. He had a wife, he had children, he had a farm, and he had laborers working for him. And Trungpa Rinpoche said that everyone thinks that Milarepa, he was the guy who lived in the cave and drank nettle soup, and lives way out alone and performed austerities. They think of him as the quintessential yogi, but actually it's Marpa who is the quintessential yogi, because he was yoking the energies of daily life, the farm, the children, the workers, his wife, all of it. And he was living this full 100% life, not simplifying it at all, but full of all the energies of life. So he is really the quintessential example of the yogi. And then there's the story of Milarepa, who was Marpa's student, and he had studied magic, and he'd become a magician. And he'd left his mother on a farm that they had. And when he came back, he found his mother living in utter poverty. She had been taken advantage of by his uncle and his uncle's family. And his mother was half starving to death. And he, Milarepa, who was now a black magician, used his magic and killed his uncle and the uncle's family, and then got tremendous remorse. Like, he realized he was incurring tons of bad karma. And he decided to go look for a teacher to try and cure the situation of having all this bad karma and get enlightened. And he went and found Marpa. And Marpa put him through all these trials. Marpa said, if I had a student, he'd build this house for me. I want this tower built out of rock. And Milarepa would build this tower, and he'd work, and he'd be sweating and slaving, and he didn't have any food, and starving. And finally he would get there, and he would go to Marpa and expect Marpa now to accept him as a student. And Marpa would say, "What do you want?" And he would say, "I built the tower you asked for." Marpa said, "I didn't ask for that tower. Tear it down." And he did this over and over again. And he was starving, and he didn't have any food. And finally Damema, Marpa's wife, took pity on Milarepa, and she gave him some food. And sounds almost Jewish. She was very kind and helpful to him. And when Marpa found out, he was furious. And he sort of booted Milarepa out, and Milarepa was about to kill himself when finally Marpa came to him and said, "Now you can be my student." And eventually he sent him off to live the rest of his life in solitude, which Milarepa was prepared to do. There are lots of stories about him. And he had his students who came to him. The two most famous students were Trungpa, who had his flaws, but was his heart son, and then Gampopa. We did the 4 Dharmas of Gampopa here tonight. We recited them. And Gampopa became his main student and really his lineage heir. It says about Marpa within his relationship with Naropa, he had to give up everything he had, not just his material possessions, but whatever he was holding back in his mind had to go. It was a continual process of opening and surrender. And this is what happens between a teacher, a Vajra master, and a student. This process of opening and surrender on the part of the student. And it's a real opening of the minds. The teacher is perfectly capable of opening his or her mind all the way. Because in fact, they have achieved egolessness, lack of sense of I. They are living in complete openness. The student, on the other hand, is very, very full of ego and is worried about themselves. What's this teacher going to think of me? And how do I behave properly? I behave properly. And, maybe will the teacher accept me? And what do I have to give the teacher? I have to give of my possessions to the teacher, and on and on and on. The teacher, meanwhile, is living in a totally different way in this state of openness. So what the teacher does is they demonstrate the openness a bit to the student. And you know what it's like when someone is open with you. It warms your heart, right? It's an act of friendship when somebody opens and shows you, sort of who they are in some genuine way. And there are lots of ways it can happen. Many, many. And it touches you. And that very touching, when you're touched, that is an opening on your part. And you perhaps communicate that openness, the feeling that you have, that being moved back to the other person. And that allows that other person to open even more. And then that further encourages the student, you perhaps, if we're going to do it this way, to be even more open. Trungpa Rinpoche called this, he said, this is what it means to be in a teacher-student relationship. This dance, he called it dancing. He called it diplomacy because it's a back and forth opening. He called it making love. And it's the essence of what happens between a teacher and a student. So he says, Trungpa Rinpoche says in this chapter, some kind of psychological surrender is necessary. A gift of some sort. That gift might be gold dust, as in the case of Marpa, just might be the student's ego, heart, openness, communication. This is why we must discuss surrendering, opening, giving up expectations before we can speak of the relationship between teacher and student. It is essential to surrender, to open yourself, to present whatever you are to the Guru, rather than trying to present yourself as a worthwhile student. It has to be much more genuine than that, human being to human being. It does not matter how much you are willing to pay, how correctly you behave, how clever you are at saying the right thing to your teacher. It is not like having an interview for a job or buying a new car. Such deception does not apply to an interview with the Guru, because he sees right through us. We must make a real commitment to being open with our teacher, being willing to give up our preconceptions. And this happened to me. Because when I first encountered Trungpa Rinpoche, he was speaking here in New York. And I was sort of going around spiritual shopping. And a friend of mine said he was going to go hear this guy. And I said, okay, I'll go. I'd like to hear him too. And this little portly guy walks in wearing a suit and tie with a blonde and a mini skirt, next to him. And I'm sitting in full lotus on the floor on a cushion. I'd done a lot of yoga in those days. And he gave a talk here in New York. It was about February or March of 1970 on a sense of humor and how important it is on the path. And it wasn't funny. And I left and I decided, no, that's not for me. I'd crossed him off the list, along with a lot of other people that I'd met too. And then my friend Charlie Rokajak, he's the one who took me to the talk actually, and I decided we were going to go to India. I sold my car, I sold the keys to my rent-controlled apartment, quit my job. I was a teacher in the public school system here, And I was going to go to India, and we figured either we'd meet someone like Ram Dass had done, some guy who could read our minds and do miracles and be like that, or we just smoke a hell of a lot of dope and have a really good time. And so we bought charter tickets on a charter flight, cheap, in August. And by this time it was July. And my cousins were in Italy. They, my cousin married an Italian guy. They had an apartment up on Park Avenue, 90th Street. And they said I could stay there. So I was camped out in their apartment. And, this is the days before air conditioning. Remember that? Any of you who are old enough. Or if you had an air conditioner, maybe you had one in the bedroom. And it was really hot. And I got on the phone with Charlie, and he was up at Tail of the Tiger, which was this first meditation center. And Trungpa Rinpoche was up there. And Charlie said, look, it's cool up here. It's really beautiful. This guy's giving talks on the Dharma, Buddha Dharma, which I knew nothing about Buddhism. Zero. I had taken a course at Yale on the organization of the Buddhist monastery in Taiwan. Why? I have no idea today. That's what I knew about Buddhism. But I figured, New York was hot. I had another month until the charter flight left. So he told me I would be camping out. I went to Abercrombie and Fitch, bought a sleeping bag and a tent, and caught a bus. And what happened was that I wound up sitting down. Rinpoche was giving interviews. And I went up sitting down with this fat little guy, so portly, big belly. His shirt was popping open, had his leg in a brace because he was partially paralyzed on his left side. In fact, my first contact with Trungpa Rinpoche, I was sitting on the front porch at Tail, this rickety farmer woodcutter's house that is now Tail of the Tiger. It's now Karmi Choling, actually. And I'm sitting on the front porch, and the screen door to the kitchen opens, and a hand comes out with a squirt gun and squirts me in the face. That was my first contact. But Rinpoche was giving interviews. And you could sign up for an interview. So I did. And it took place in a little anteroom to his bedroom. He had this tiny bedroom that he shared with Diana. And he had a little anteroom to it with a desk, just big enough for a desk, and 2 chairs and a window. And I went and sat down there with him. Couldn't think of a thing to say. We just sat there in silence. He was smoking, looking out the window. Finally he said, well, maybe we should end. So I thanked him and left. And then I felt, gee, I could have done more than that. I could have done something with that time. So I signed up for a second interview. And this time it took place on the front porch at what was then Tail of the Tiger, looking out across this dirt road and meadow and down maybe a half a mile or so to a stream and a little 2-lane highway. And we were sitting there together, and something just opened in me. And I told him, how unhappy I was in my life and how confused and how I just didn't understand anything about religion or the meaning or purpose of life or how to live. And because that opened in me, something happened, and the communication between us really happened in a way that I never expected. And that moment was like my life turned 180 degrees in that just minute. But he was a master at that. You say he was a real Vajra master. And so many people who met him experienced moments like that in one way or another, and that's really why all those people stayed and became his students. He really wasn't that great a public speaker. If you listen to the videos, they can be edited into terrific books, but when you listen to the videos, they're hard to get your hands around. But one-on-one, my second wife was his secretary. She used to call him Mr. Magic. And it was because of that ability to connect heart to heart, open mind to mind with people, and open things up and show the student a different kind of openness. I didn't think I was going to tell you all that. I don't even know if this should go on YouTube. So he says some kind of psychological surrender is necessary. A gift of some sort. It is essential to surrender, to open yourself, to present whatever you are, rather than trying to present yourself as a worthwhile student. I had no preconceptions about this guy, or very little. He was just a fat, chubby, coffee-skinned guy with a sort of Tibeto-English accent, and I didn't really understand a lot of the teachings, that I don't even know if I'd heard him give teachings at that point. But he had the ability to communicate with a person if they were open. I remember one time sitting with him, I've told this story recently. Later, still in that summer, I was sitting with him in a room, and people were coming in and out and saying things to him, and then they'd leave, and this woman came in, and she was, I think, a benefactor. Maybe she had given a little money, and she came in and she was very uptight and being friendly, but nervous, frightened. And she came in and she said, Trungpa Rinpoche, so nice to meet you. I've heard so much about you. And how is your lovely wife? And, when are you expecting to be a father? And isn't this beautiful weather we're having? I mean, I'm not exaggerating. This is what it was like. At rapid fire speed, all these, trite little things that people say, right? That. Now, Rinpoche in those days he loved the English language, and he was playing with it, trying to sort of understand it. The expressions. So here she is, and she's saying all this, and finally and he's very kind, and just, yes, like that, and, shaking her hand and thanking her and whatever it was. And finally she just sort of blows herself out the door, that she was so frightened. And he turns to me and he says, "Not a swinger." Meaning she was so tense that she couldn't open. But he used this term swinger, like, you remember that term? It was big back then. So he says, such deception does not apply to an interview with a guru because he sees right through us. We must make a real commitment to being open with our teacher, willing to give up our preconceptions. And communication is the key. He says, what you really need to be asking yourself when you meet with the person, is the guru really able to see through your masks, communicate with you properly, directly? In searching for a teacher, this seems to be the guideline rather than fame or wisdom. Now, I'm emphasizing the individual, but our lives take on the quality of teacher too, in varying degrees. Because once we begin to absorb the teachings, life itself becomes a great teacher. And one of the greatest aspects of life that teaches us, in fact, the key aspect of life that teaches us, and we only begin to recognize it when we begin to see the possibilities in the teachings, is disappointment. Loss and disappointment, and learning how to go on with that. That we have all these ideas about who we are and what we were going to do and how we were going to succeed and live this terrific life that we wanted to have. And now we're not. But what begins to happen is that the more we begin to connect to the teachings, the more we begin to see that we were chasing rainbows, chimeras, false gods, and that what the teachings are pointing to is the real goods. And what the real goods are as a love of this present moment and love of being able to communicate with the people in our lives and be of help. Love of being able to come present and rest in this space. So loss and disappointment become the guru, the teacher, at some point. He says here, in order that you might open, you will probably have to undergo tests by your spiritual friend and by life situations in general. All of these tests taking the form of disappointment. We tend to wear suits of armor, and we have to give them up. Really, what we're doing is discovering our tenderness, our hearts, our genuineness, becoming real human beings instead of self-serving, self-aggrandizing, selfish egos. That has to begin to be opened up, and an individual like a guru can do it, but also life situations, especially when we are practicing and studying the Dharma. He says, we hope we will not have to completely undress, but our spiritual friend or life is going to make us. When Rinpoche died, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, this gentleman, came and gave teachings. He gave teachings first in Boulder, and then in at Tail of the Tiger, then called Karme Choling by then, and then in Halifax. I think there was a fourth place. I've heard of a fourth place. And Rinpoche's main student was a fellow that had the title the Regent. And Khyentse Rinpoche, was living, while he was in Boulder and giving teachings, he was ensconced at Marpa House, which was a community place for practitioners. They lived there, and there was a suite for visiting teachers, and that's where Khyentse Rinpoche was. And across the street, the Regent was staying with another of Rinpoche's students for some reason. And for some reason I was visiting the Regent. And the Regent said to me, "Have you had an interview with Khyentse Rinpoche yet?" And I said, "No." I hadn't even thought to ask for one. And the Regent says, "Milani," who was his main secretary, "get Baker an interview with Khyentse Rinpoche." So a day or two later, at the appointed hour, I went up to the suite, and I was shown in, and there were four of us. Khyentse Rinpoche spent his life in bed. He was a huge man. He was like 6'6", must have weighed 300 pounds, somewhere up in that range. And he spent his life with texts, his beads, turning pages of the texts, and people were so devoted to him. And they would come in and out, and if they were Tibetan, they'd touch heads, foreheads. You know, that's the way Tibetans greet each other with affection, touch your forehead. And he would write, make notes. He wrote texts and teachings. So we each got to ask one question. My question was, just trying to remember the other questions. I can remember one other question. My question was, I said to Khyentse Rinpoche, I can hardly imagine the rest of my life, I mean I was only 43 years old then, without someone like Trungpa Rinpoche in it. Should I go looking for another teacher? And he said, no. He said, you have to find the teacher in your heart. And really, that's what we all have to do, is find the teacher in our heart. And the way we do it is through practice, through study, through exposing ourselves to people who know more than we do and can help us in our understanding, deepen our understanding, and to make it real, this understanding of the Dharma. Then it becomes, when we make it real, then it becomes in our heart. He said, at some point you begin to see the guru quality in every life situation, the opportunity to be open. And by open, it's not just sort of being open like who you are and the things you're ashamed of and all that. There's that too. But what it really means is letting go of the preconceptions that we have about what it is that is going to make me happy in this situation, in this life. And being willing to be here with whatever life deals us, and to respond to that in a way that is creative, useful, helpful to others and ourselves. He says, here it is, he teaches you, the teacher, or the teachings. You know, this could be, you read a book by Khyentse Rinpoche, and it teaches you this. Or it can be an individual. He teaches you that you can stop complaining, wishing things were otherwise. You can rest in the open space of what is, and realize egolessness and no suffering, and the 3 marks of existence. And in doing that, you transcend suffering, you discover the joy of the Dharma, the real joy of reality, and you give up self-importance and self-concern. And that's what's, those things all go together. You begin to see that all situations in life offer you the opportunity to be as open as you are with the teacher, and so all things can become the guru. The demons that we encounter, like Milarepa encountered demons in his cave, they're the thoughts. They're the thoughts of, I can't endure this. I don't want this. I hate this. Those are the demons. I'm really unhappy at the way my life is turning out. I want something different. And they torment us, those demons. Wow. He says, when the internal guru begins to function, then you can never escape the demand to open. The basic intelligence follows you everywhere. You cannot escape your own shadow. Though it is not external entities who are watching us and haunting us, we haunt ourselves. So if we're depressed, in our lives at times, that depression, those are the demons, those are the thoughts about me, about I want it to be different. I don't like this. I. And really, what we have to begin to understand through the Dharma is that This is about contacting open space, the reality of non-ego, of opening out. As we breathe out and our awareness goes out into this space, we're right here. And it's not even we. It's just this. This open space of awareness, space, this space of awareness in which everything arises and passes away is utterly beautiful. And it's full of kindness and warmth and opportunity to be in love. Giving up our preconceptions about who we are and the way the world has to be for us. When the situations of life start to become your guru, someone asks, does it matter what form the situation takes? Does it matter what situation you find yourself in? You have no choice at all, he answers. Whatever happens is an expression of the teachings. The situation could be painful or inspiring, but both pain and pleasure are one in this openness of seeing the situation as the teacher. So, we could have a discussion. Did I say too much? What do you think, Alan? Did I say too much? Your mind is blank? Okay. Is this okay to put up on YouTube? You think? Okay. Anybody want to say anything? Complaints? Mark.
I just had a thought. The relationship you described, teacher and student, there's examples, where that's abuse, where it's not a healthy relationship. And what just struck me is that in explaining that life can be the guru as well, it's the same thing. Life can slap you down and be just as abusive, and a relationship can be just as destructive, but you still have to learn from it. You still have to deal with it. You still have to just deal with it and learn from it. So,
life becomes the teacher when you begin to appreciate egolessness, giving up belief in I. Then life becomes a very positive teacher. And it doesn't slap you down like that. I mean, it might slap you down, but you realize that what it's slapping down is your egotism. And at the same time, the student has to be able to see the flip side, which is the beauty of this world without ego. And then the path becomes a path. That doesn't mean it's easy, because ego, the belief in I, is so powerful and so subtle, and inheres as it falls away. It finds ways to hang on and hang on and hang on, in subtler and subtler forms, and it always just causes tremendous suffering. That's what the whole thing of ego is. It's just suffering, because it wants things to be this way and not that way. And life constantly is confounding our egotism. Utterly, terribly.
If I can add to that, I think the trick is to remember that life is a gift despite the hardships that come our way. At least that's helped me tremendously.
Thank you. There's some old dogs here. Come on, Fido. I was hoping you'd chime in. Huh?
Should I throw the mic at him?
You're going to throw the mic? No, don't do that. Rochelle wants to say something.
I like to talk about Milarepa. It's hard to believe that in his lifetime there was no such thing as a cell phone, an iPad, a telephone, a computer, but yet he had complete communication with his guru while he was on retreat. And the way he communicated with him was he was on retreat practicing the practices that his guru gave him. And he was one-pointedly dedicated to his practice, where he wouldn't even go out to beg for food. He would just like throw nettles from a tree that was growing nearby in a pot of hot water, and that's what he would eat. But the realization that he had from his practice, he would compose dohas, which were songs of realization, and sing these dohas and offer them to his guru, Marpa. And then Marpa sometimes would just appear in the sky in front of him, and they would have complete meeting of the mind, complete communication. And I think that in this day and age, very few people have lost touch. Many people have lost touch with communication, in a sense we're communicating with our heart or with our mind or our speech, and it's all about electronics now. And I think that's what Khyentse Rinpoche was talking about too. It's like whatever you feel in your heart. And when you were with Trungpa Rinpoche, he was communicating with you directly without anything else in the way. And I think that's important to remember when we're practicing, that we can just open in a different way to the phenomenal world.
I think too the teachings, Trungpa Rinpoche always said, we didn't know any other teachers. And Rinpoche is a title, right? Means precious one. And there are lots of teachers who are called Rinpoche. We thought it was his name because we didn't know any others. And so we tended to fixate on him. And he always said, and it always confounded me at the time, he always said, I'm just the representative of the lineage. He said, the power of the lineage is coming through me. He's like a conduit, he regarded himself. And it's really the power of the lineage that is the teacher. And we connect with it however we can. It's been going on for 2,600 years at this point. We used to say 2,500 years, but now it's closer to say 26, isn't it? We kind of got over that watershed. And yeah, I think that's really what we're connecting with.
The story of the building of the tower, and I didn't tell you to build that tower, tear it down. The story of the building of the tower, and I didn't tell you to build that tower, tear it down. And
there were many of them.
Where do you draw the line between being sadistic and being masochistic. It sounds like there could be some very bad teachers out there.
Could be. I mean, it's completely personal.
Yeah.
Completely up to you.
I mean, the guy was starving himself and building all these buildings for this man.
Yeah. Well, he had a lot of bad karma. He'd committed murder.
Okay.
You know? And
okay. All right. That answers that right there. Okay.
You know.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, theoretically, I mean, the way I understood it was that he had to go through this kind of hell because he had created these obstacles in his own mind.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of stories about teachers.
Yeah. I forgot the part about committing murder. That's right. That's a big part.
I mean, it's really a matter of magic, and if the teacher sees what the student needs in order to open, and the teacher is not going to settle for less. I remember there was a guy who showed up in our Sangha, and I think he might be the only person that Trungpa Rinpoche ever threw out. Kicked him out. Later he came back and somehow made peace with Trungpa Rinpoche and came and became a student again. But we were all shocked, you know. Rinpoche did that. Actually threw him out. And he said the reason that he threw him out was because this fellow was taking what Rinpoche said, everything he said, and twisting it into something that served his ego. And so Rinpoche said he couldn't say a thing to this person that would create openness. It was all being used, you know, to build up his own ego. But evidently he came back and managed to get it right in some way. I've heard, I haven't seen him in years, but I've heard he's around now and, you know, a student. You were going to say something, Scott? Okay.
Do you remember the other question?
Huh? Do I remember what?
Do you remember the other question to Dego Khyentse Rinpoche?
Yeah, I do remember one of them. I remember one. Good friend of mine. A woman. Joanne Fagan. Anybody know her? Michael's wife. She was sitting to my left. She was the last question. And she had been crying nonstop. And finally, through her tears, she asked Khyentse Rinpoche, and of course he had to go through a translator. Right? He didn't speak English. She said to him, she was a Vajrayogini practitioner. Remember I mentioned working with this Yidam, the Vajrayogini. She represents prajna, transcendent knowledge, which we're going to talk about more here. And she is sort of the personification of it, and she represents your prajna. And you do these practices where you visualize her. And there's a particular description of her, and she's bright red, her hairs are in flames, she's got particular things she's wearing, she's 16 years old, blah, blah, blah. She could have been a 37-year-old, an old hag bearing 37 marks. She takes many forms. But in this one, that's what she is. She's bright red. And this person said, through her tears, when I do... It's going to make me cry. She said, when I do my Vajrayogini practice, I can't see Vajrayogini. All I can see is Trungpa Rinpoche. So you know that she is Trungpa Rinpoche. You know that Vajrayogini is. You know that. You're told that in the texts. That she's your root teacher. And she said, all I can see is Trungpa Rinpoche. And she's crying and crying. And Khyentse Rinpoche said, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Just do the practice and see Trungpa Rinpoche. Oh, God. to forget about Boshugi. About that red 16-year-old flaming dancing. So that was the other question. Who asked that? Was it Mark? No, it was you, Carmen. Sorry. That's the only other question I can remember. There were 4 of us. Yes.
Well, that's a really good example of why it's important to check in with the teacher, even if you received these precious abhishekas, and even if it's just sitting practice, and you go off and practice. But when you check in with the teacher, you're kind of like checking in with what's going right and what's going wrong. And so maybe she thought she wasn't practicing right, but Khenze Rinpoche said, keep going, you're fine.
Yeah, you're doing it you're doing
it
fine.
And it really helps. It really does.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should end. On August 3rd and 4th, I'll be going up to hear Changling Rinpoche speak about, I think I'm really interested to hear him teach on cutting through. Have you read that quote that we sent out? It was generally, Scott has, and Carmen, you have. It's amazing, isn't it? I had no idea that a Tibetan fellow would think that about cutting through. I've even heard that he thinks it's Dharma. I don't think I can say it, but the gist of it was that this is the text for our time, that it should be studied, and more than studied, it should be practiced. He said every era has its own style, and there are teachings which come out which are appropriate to that style and time and place. This is the gist of what he said. And he said cutting through is the text for this time and place, this era. And so it'd be really interesting. Okay, and so we're going to go. I'm just saying that maybe we'll organize. We could all go up on the train together. You touch. The way you get up there is you go up from Grand Central, or points north. There are other places to get on the train, and then you get off at Irvington. For you, it's $6.25 each way. You're going to drive up? Okay. Yeah.
The program seems to be changing.
Oh, yeah? Okay. All right, so let's end. Let's say dedicate the merit, and we will have some refreshments. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.